This is episode 66 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Paul Edmondson, Head of Research for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and co-editor with Stanley Wells of the Shakespeare Circle, an alternative biography. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
What we have is fairly anecdotal evidence, but there could be something in it. John Ward was the vicar of Stratford Upon Avon from 1662 to 1681, and there are 5 entries in his diary to do with Shakespeare and his family.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When William Shakespeare died in Stratford Upon Avon, England in 1616, the world lost an incredible soul who left behind a legacy that would far outlast his years. But how did the world's greatest playwright die? And why was he buried in a small, humble church in a quaint market town instead of lauded from the rooftops of London as the world mourned his passing? Here to take us back to 1616 and walk us through the myth, the legends, and the facts surrounding the death of William Shakespeare is our guest, Darren Freebury Jones. Darren Freebury Jones is a lecturer in Shakespeare studies at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. His work involves building and developing relationships with schools, universities, and organizations in the USA through regular teaching tours. He works on the Trust's online educational resources as well as lecturing at the Shakespeare Center. His 2016 doctoral thesis examined Thomas Kyd's influence on Shakespeare's early work. His recent and forthcoming work on the plays of authors such as Shakespeare, Kyd, Lyly, Marlowe, and others can be found in Journal of Early Modern Studies, Medieval and Renaissance Drama in England, Renaissance and Reformation, and Texas Studies in Literature and Language, among several others. Hello, Darren. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Cassidy.
So how old was William Shakespeare when he died?
Shakespeare was 52 when he died, and there's a chance he actually died on his birthday. The line from The Winter's Tale springs to mind. Thou metst with things dying, I with things new born. Shakespeare was baptized on the 26th of April, 1564. And many people think he was born 3 days earlier, which happened to be St. George's Day. Baptisms usually took place within 3 days of a child being born, and parents were instructed by the prayer book to make sure their children were baptized no later than the first Sunday after the birth. So it's unlikely that Shakespeare was born earlier than the previous Sunday, the 23rd of April.
Very poetic of Shakespeare. We'd expect nothing less. Ben Jonson and Edward Allen both died at almost 70 years of age, outliving Shakespeare by close to 20 years. Was 52 considered an old age for early modern England, or did William Shakespeare die young?
I've heard very conflicting accounts about average life expectancy during the early modern period. Some people say early 30s to mid 40s, and I think there's a great many factors to account for. For instance, we should remember that Shakespeare was incredibly lucky to survive beyond 3 months old, given the outbreak of plague in Stratford Upon Avon in 1564. It could be argued that Shakespeare's greatest achievement wasn't all the incredible plays and poems he produced, but actually surviving this outbreak. A few of his siblings died very young. His sister Joan at 2 months old, Margaret at 1 year old, and Anne at 8. Although his one sister, Joan Hart, actually lived into her late 70s, 77, in fact. One doesn't get the sense that Shakespeare was seen as being terribly old when he died. A certain J.M., who might have been a chap named James Mabbs in an elegy appended to the first folio, laments, "We wondered, Shakespeare, that thou wentst so soon." So it seems that, at least in this writer's eyes, Shakespeare died fairly young.
So maybe he didn't necessarily, no one was surprised at his death, let's say, but there were people who lived longer. Now, do we have records of how he died?
The short answer, Cassidy, is no. No, we don't. But if I may, I'd like to take you and your listeners back in time.
Okay.
1613. We know that the Globe Theatre burned down that year during a production of Shakespeare and John Fletcher's All Is True, also known as Henry VIII. And remarkably, for a theatre with a potential capacity of 3,000, the only casualty was a man's breeches, which were put out with a bottle of ale. Shakespeare appears to have finished with the theatre this year. None of his plays are dated later than 1613, and maybe retired to Stratford. Whether the burning of the theatre was his cue to leave London, or whether he returned to Stratford because he was struggling with health issues at this time, is unknown.
There's a rumor that he died after extensive drinking at a tavern with Ben Jonson, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you if there is any veracity to this claim.
What we have is fairly anecdotal evidence, but there could be something in it. John Ward was the vicar of Stratford Upon Avon from 1662 to 1681, and there are 5 entries in his diary to do with Shakespeare and his family. He gives us some really interesting information, although we should note that these accounts are dated decades after Shakespeare died. For instance, Ward tells us he has heard that Mr. Shakespeare was a natural wit without any art at all. He frequented the plays all his younger time, but in his elder days lived at Stratford and supplied the stage with 2 plays every year. Now, this is what he has to say about Shakespeare's death. Shakespeare, Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting, and it seems drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted. As you allude to, Cassidy, the merry meeting refers to a supposed night drinking with fellow poets and playwrights Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton. This is the only source for this account of Shakespeare's death. Some people accept this account, others are more wary. I quite like the idea of the greatest writer in the history of the English language dying of a really bad hangover. I can empathize with that.
Well, yes. And of course, it adds the artistry to his life that we would enjoy. But I read that taverns and pubs were generally the place where men of London would get their regular meals, such that going there was not necessarily the drunken partying image of Shakespeare that some might take away from the legend. Is it possible Shakespeare had just gone to dinner with a friend that night?
If the meeting that Ward refers to did occur, it was most likely at Shakespeare's home in Stratford Upon Avon, New Place. I think it's therefore possible that Shakespeare simply dined his fellow poets and playwrights. There are a couple of apocryphal stories about Shakespeare being a bit of a hellraiser when it came to drinking, including his challenging some infamous drinkers in Bidford upon Avon, a village in Warwickshire, where he fell asleep under a crab apple tree. The fact of the matter is that most people would likely be a little tipsy, even if they were just meeting for dinner in London, because people tended to drink cheap ale, as the water was considered unsafe.
Well, why do some historians believe that the bard died of pneumonia? I mean, he said a fever there contracted. Are they extrapolating there that means pneumonia?
Well, some scholars have pointed out that Shakespeare's signature in his will are a little, if you'll excuse the pun, shaky. So it's conceivable he was suffering from pneumonia or maybe typhoid fever at this point, which might have caused him to tremble.
Where was Shakespeare when he died? Was he attended by anyone, and are there official records of his death?
It's believed that Shakespeare's death occurred in New Place, and that Shakespeare would have been attended by his son-in-law, Dr. John Hall, the town physician. The only known end-of-life documentation is a record of his burial 2 days later. The Stratford Parish Register records Shakespeare's burial on April the 25th, 1616, and the inscription on Shakespeare's funerary monument in Holy Trinity Church tells us that he died 2 days earlier, on April the 23rd. Now, visitors to Stratford upon Avon can see his gravestone at Holy Trinity, They can also see the funerary monument I mentioned, one of just two incontrovertible likenesses of Shakespeare carved in limestone by Gerard Johnson, as well as a rather cryptic poem celebrating Shakespeare's greatness as a writer.
Shakespeare updated his will a month before his death. Was that a coincidence, or do you think the proximity to his death might suggest Shakespeare knew he was dying?
Well, in his will, Shakespeare claims that he's in perfect health, and then he goes and dies just under a month later. So it's possible that he knew he was going to shuffle off his mortal coil at some point in the near future. Now, the will, drawn up by Shakespeare's lawyer friend Francis Collins, was first drafted in January 1616. The changes made on 25th of March that year could reflect the scandal going on regards his daughter Judith and her husband Thomas Quiney. They married on the 10th of February 1616. Quiney had an affair with a certain Margaret Wheeler, who died in childbirth just a month after Thomas and Judith's wedding. Shakespeare's alterations suggest that he was taking measures to protect his family. The phrase son-in-law is struck out and Judith's name inserted instead, and money was explicitly denied to Quiney unless he could bestow on Judith lands of equal value.
Did Shakespeare have a lavish funeral?
Although Shakespeare makes no mention of funeral arrangements in his will, we can safely assume that Shakespeare at least had a funeral. But Shakespeare's funeral would have most likely been a fairly understated affair, with a few words appointed to be read for the service in the Church of England's liturgy, as set down in the Book of Common Prayer. Shakespeare doesn't even appear to have been buried in a coffin. His body was wrapped only in a woolen shroud, which was regular burial practice. Shakespeare makes bequests in his will to certain friends in London and in Stratford of mourning rings. And it's possible that these rings were handed out at his funeral.
Is that not surprising for someone of Shakespeare's status? I mean, I would have expected him to at least have the suggestion of him being buried somewhere like Westminster Abbey or somewhere of significance to London and even England. I mean, he was serving at the highest levels.
It's interesting you should say that, Cassidy, because a chap named William Bass suggested that Shakespeare should have been buried at Westminster Abbey in an elegy written at some point between 1616 and 1623. This is what William Bass writes. "Renowned Spencer lieth thought more nigh to learned Chaucer, and rare Beaumont lie a little nearer Spencer to make room for Shakespeare in your threefold." Personally, I think it's appropriate that Shakespeare was buried in Stratford Upon Avon, which, despite commuting to London throughout his career, seems to have always been home in his mind. There's something of a lineup in Holy Trinity Church, with Shakespeare's gravestone next to other family members. So from left to right, you've got Anne Shakespeare, Shakespeare himself, Thomas Nash, the first husband of Shakespeare's granddaughter, Elizabeth Barnard, daughter of John and Susanna Hall. And then you've got John Hall and Susanna. I think it's fitting that he was buried along with his family in the market town where he was born, where he grew up, and where he died.
Yes, I think it's very fitting as well. I've always felt like the curse that he put on his bones was to guard against people like William Bass, perhaps, thinking that maybe we should move Shakespeare to a place of more prominence. I think maybe Shakespeare felt it was fitting too.
Yeah.
Now, I know we would love to explore some of these rumors and history further. So do you have books or resources that you can recommend we look at to learn more about Shakespeare's death?
My colleague Sir Stanley Wells's book, Shakespeare for All Time, that provides a wonderfully rich account of Shakespeare's life and death in Stratford. You've also got the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust website, which has got a vast range of blogs on Shakespeare's family, his will, and his gravestone. So that's www.shakespeare.org.uk.
We will link to both of these in the show notes for today's episode. Those are good suggestions. Thank you. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Oh, I'm glad I get the complete works of Shakespeare.
Oh, of course. We couldn't leave those out.
Oh, that's a tricky one. I think my answer to this question would change every time you ask me. But the first novel I ever read was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And it's probably inspired and helped shape who I am in many ways. So when I was a little boy, I used to convince friends that I had a laboratory under my kitchen and that I'd created monsters who resided therein. So I was a bit of an odd child, I guess you could say. But Shelley's work helped me develop as a storyteller myself. And though I'm no modern Prometheus, the creative aspects of my personality maybe have something to do with reading this book at the age of 8.
Well, I liked your selection to start with, but after hearing the story that goes with it, I think it's perfect. Well done. Your island will be nicely set up.
Thank you.
So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
So I'm currently working on the first edition since 1901 of the early modern playwright Thomas Kyd's collected works. Kyd shared a room with fellow dramatist Christopher Marlowe in London, and he's most famous for writing the Spanish tragedy, which deeply influenced Shakespeare's Hamlet. But I and my co-editors, including such scholars as Brian Vickers, Martin Wiggins, and David Bevington, we're arguing for a much larger and more varied canon of works. I'm also hoping to publish a monograph on Kyd's profound impact on Shakespeare's dramaturgy, which I feel hasn't been properly recognized.
Wow. Well, we'll look forward to keeping up with those when they become available. Well, Darren Freebury Jones, thank you so much for being here today and walking us through the story of Shakespeare's death. It's been a delight speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Cassidy. It's been a real pleasure and privilege.
You can find links to the resources Darren mentioned in today's episode, as well as find out more on Darren himself when you stop over at the show notes. Find more history about Shakespeare at castycash.com/episode 66. That's castycash.com/EP66. If you like the history you're learning here each week, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a member. Members get access to exclusive content, bonus episodes not available anywhere else. Learn more about that at castycash.com/member. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Casty Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope you learn something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.